I'm now going to show you how you will find your EGON DC-Hub bracket and what to do with it. First of all, you will take the screws out that are being used to leave the lid or the cover on your bracket, and your lid is going to come with a protective screen on it. These covers are being put on so that in transit or while they're being stored and produced, your covers aren't scratched. This will then be mounted in that orientation on your EGON bracket. I'm now going to show you how to mount the EGON board into the bracket. The EGON board and bracket will be delivered with these mountings. The way to attach them onto your bracket will be that these little bits will first be attached to the bracket from the back. The best way to do this is that you take the screw, stick it through the back, and then put the nut, which has got a thread all the way through, on from the front. You'll now have to do that for all 10 mounts in there. It is very important not to leave any away, just because you want to save some time, because when you take fuses in and out of the board, you might break the board itself when you don't use all the mounting holes for it. I will now show you how you can mount your DC-Hub bracket for your installation. You have got 10 large holes on the back of the bracket, which enables the bracket to be mounted onto a surface with the cables all running on top of that surface. Just make sure that you will install the little mounts for the DC-Hub before you mount the bracket onto a surface. You can also mount the DC-Hub bracket behind a surface with these 4 holes. Just make sure you have a cutout in your panel where you want to install the DC-Hub. Drill holes in these locations, put screws through, and the DC-Hub bracket will mount behind a panel. So I have now put all 10 mounts in. It looks like that from the front. It will look like that from the back. You are now ready to fit your EGON board into the bracket. So all the holes will now line up with the holes on the board itself, and you can now use the same screw that you put into the back to start screwing the board down. Do not fully tighten them before you haven't got all the screws in. That makes it easier to move the board a little bit. Once all the screws are in, you have to firmly tighten the screws to make sure they will not come loose over time. These holes in your DC-Hub bracket are made for cable ties, like these cable ties. You may find it easiest to put the cable ties in before you put the DC-Hub itself into the bracket, because it's easier to get underneath it. Just in case you want to do this later, or when you add onto it, you can bend the cable tie like this, so that later on it will look very similar to this. And you can slot the cable tie in like this. The cable tie itself will hold the cable down and prevent any rattling on the contact, which might break the copper and break the contact to the board over time if you don't use the cable tie. I will now show you how to connect the cable to your DC-Hub. First of all, you take the insulation of the cable and you make sure it is fresh, non-corroded copper that you will insert into the connector of the DC-Hub. Then make sure the amount of cable you take off is long enough, but not too long. Have a look at the connector, you will see the right length for it. Then take the cable with the copper being exposed. Insert the cable with red to positive, black to negative. Make sure the cable goes in all the way until you feel a resistance at the end. With the cable pushed in all the way, keep holding it in so it doesn't slip out. Take a screwdriver and pre-tighten the cable. Which way around you do this does not matter. Just make sure there is no fuse in it. After you have pre-tightened your screws, finish the rest of the installation. And once you're done running all the cables to all the different bits and pieces, and you've connected to your lights and there's no loose ends around anymore, and you're sure you're happy with your installation, then you go back to the board and you take what is called a torque screwdriver, and according to the specification sheet that is delivered with the board for the different torque settings for these connectors, you tighten the screws up to the specified torque, which is, as you can see, a fair bit of force even on these little connectors. This is very important because the connector in there acts like a crimp. It's not a screw that will squash into your cable. It's a little lift mechanism that pulls up from the bottom and it acts like a crimp. So it's very important to put the right force on it so you don't get hot connectors. After you've finished your installation and you're happy with all the cables where they run, you've tightened all the screws to the specified settings, you then tighten the cable ties to make sure you push it in a little bit, make sure you relieve the stress of the cable in the connector, and then you tighten the cable tie. Make sure it is really firm. After you've tightened it, it's highly recommended to use a flush cut cable cutter. Snip it off and your cable is very firm and tight. Looking at the board, you will notice that every fuse has got a LED connector to it. Once you connect the circuit, you will find that your LED will turn on if it is possible that a current will run through the circuit. Put a fuse in like this and you will find the LED turns off. This LED will now only come on if the fuse blows, indicating that there's a problem with that particular circuit, which will make it also very, very easy to do fault finding on your installation. Just look for the LED light. Now the installation of the cover as the last step in your installation. Once everything is done, you're happy with the installation, put the cover onto your DC-Hub, tighten the screws in the corners. Don't over tighten them, they don't have to be extremely firm, they just have to be tight. All they do is hold a cover on. It is important that you put all 5 screws in. Once these screws are in place, you're finished with the installation.